Good morning, everybody, and welcome to uh, today's webinar with Giulia Sciorati. We will wait just one more minute to wait for all the people entering the room, and then we will start. We will also please ask you to turn off your cameras and microphone during the presentation. Thank you so much. Of course, you will be able to speak in a while, but we just would like to ask your cooperation in the first part of our seminar. So it's 11:02, so let me start by welcoming you all. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. We're so happy and so glad to start our 2021 with such a guest and with a very pregnant and important issue and matter that we will try to address. So I am Alessia Paolillo, and I'm the head of the strategic communication team here at European Guanxi, and I'm really glad to introduce you Giulia Sciorati. Giulia Sciorati is an associate research fellow at ISPI Asia Centre for the China program. She earned a PhD in international studies with a dissertation on the international, domestic, and individual constraint to China's counterterrorism policy choices in Xinjiang from 1996 to 2017. The seminar will present current relations between China and Europe, discussing the impact of the SARS-CoV-2, as COVID-19 pandemic on the image of Europe in China, and China's policy of major European economies, together with the main challenges that will need to be faced in the short term. Particular attention will be devoted to the political ramifications of the comprehensive agreement on investments, especially with regards to the issue of forced labor. So I will now leave the floor to Giulia. I would just want to remind you that if you have some questions you want to ask that comes up in your mind during the presentation, you can decide whether to write them down in a chat and we will collect and read them all at the end of the presentation, or you can wait for the end of the presentation and then we will able you to turn on your microphone and camera. You can also ask directly the question to Giulia. And also at the end of the webinar, don't leave because we will submit to you a poll regarding some questions that regards the webinar itself. And the results of this poll will be published in our group, our European Guanxi group, like the private group on LinkedIn, in which you all, if you're part of European Guanxi, for sure are. And then through the answers that we receive from these polls, we will launch a discussion through which we will collect all the opinions that you will send us through email for the newsletter. If it's not really clear to you, don't worry, you will understand it step by step. And now I will first leave the floor to Giulia. Thank you again for your lecture, and then we will come back later.
Thank you very much, Alessia, and thank you very much to you all. Good Saturday, everyone. I'd like to thank Alessia and Laura for the invitation this morning and all the European Guanxi for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this great project. As Alessia mentioned, today we have quite a lot to talk about, and I will do my best actually to do justice to all these topics, but I also hope I will manage to be concise. I've practiced, but I can't assure it 100%. I hope not to be a traditional speaker and this not to be a traditional seminar, as I am sincerely looking forward to a full discussion with everyone that showed up this morning. So please do feel free to ask me as many questions as you like, of course, but also feel free to contribute your own opinion. I think that at this particular juncture in time for people interested in China and Chinese studies, we are all here to talk together, and myself included. I wish that we will manage to understand a little more together by, giving each other feedback and sharing our opinions. Just a simple and fair warning, in this presentation, I will make reference to some studies. I will then paste the full list in the chat at the end of the presentation so that you can have a look at them after the webinar if you're interested in some of them. When we started to discuss the contents of this webinar with Alessia and Laura, we soon came to a fairly plain realization, which is that the issue of China and Europe relations in 2021 is quite multifaceted, even more than it had been in the past. Indeed, as a catalyst, the pandemic has been spurring some latest trends, as well as uncovering some new ones. Therefore, this presentation goes along three main lines. I will discuss first what China's aims for Europe are today after all that happened, all that changed in 2020. Second, I will also look at what scholars agree to be this major turning point in EU-China relations, which is the well-known comprehensive agreement on investment. There is a lot to talk about the CAI, but I think that with regards to international politics and relations with China in the EU, the most interesting part is the one regarding forced labor. So I will keep the focus especially on this topic. And third, I will look at what the biggest European economies currently believe to be the best approaches to China in the short term. So basically the idea that the general question will be, what will be the foreign policy choices of the major European economies towards China in 2021, at least in the first part of 2021. But then first things first, so what China sees today when it looks to Europe. Well, unfortunately, we have this big issue with the pandemic for people studying China, which is the fact that international mobility is unfortunately extremely limited. So the main sources we can really use to build on our consideration on China's opinion of Europe after the acute phase of the pandemic are rather few and are mainly constituted by official documents, speeches, remarks, and articles from Chinese decision makers. Well, there is a comprehensive overview of all these sources and what are the main themes and topics and reiteration within these particular sources that was presented by Guido Samarani from Venice University. He's basically the most renowned sinologist currently working in the Italian academia. He just wrote a chapter on China and Europe in 2021, including a comprehensive overview of the literature of the past year. So if you're interested in going in depth in all the sources and the main narratives that have been built with regards to Europe from Chinese viewpoint, I really urge you to have a look at that. But still, I'm going to pass on a couple of those. And first and foremost, certainly there is this China's white paper on the country's anti-COVID efforts, which is entitled Fighting COVID-19, China in Action, which is an important and a crucial, I think, point to start discussing this changing approach after the pandemic. Although most of this white paper concentrates on domestic policy, there is a fourth paragraph, a fourth part of this white paper that actually puts forward China's aim to build a global health community. We've seen this idea of the global health community especially present in the rhetoric of several Chinese diplomats, not only from China, but especially looking state by state, nations by nation, within embassies and diaspora community. During the most acute health crisis in the spring of 2020. And this notion of the global health community has then evolved into what is now being called the Health Silk Road. But this particular section of the white paper is particularly enlightening as it highlights that the pandemic had first each member of the international community to make a choice, either towards science and rationality or fueling political disputes, strengthen unity and cooperation or isolate, and again, towards multilateralism or isolationism. China within the paper and also moving forward towards in other contexts is of course presented as a banner for science and rationality, unity and cooperation, and a strong promoter, or the strongest promoter of multilateralism. Yet, what is interesting is, of course, the fact that in the text, the country not only stresses the work that China had done so far internationally, mentioning the donations of health equipment, especially into the most fragile regions in the world, up to the support provided to the World Health Organization during and after the most acute phase of the health crisis. But it also, and this is the most interesting point in my view, is the fact that in the paper, China also heavily criticizes those actors that pointed the finger at China because the measure that they had been enacting for fighting COVID-19 have been proving inefficient. Of course, these last few words is a rephrasing from the paper's words. And the main themes that emerge from the paper as a whole are, of course, China's willingness to rebuild a reputation for the country with all its partners, including Europe, and I would add, paying the foremost attention to Europe by stressing the positive role that China played during the acute phase of the health emergency, and at the same time by making accusations against the other great powers of the international system, and read the United States, which, unlike China, had been focusing on fueling political disputes as well as isolating. So China's aim to build back a partnership with its European partners and possibly move them away, of course, from Trump's United States, as well as make them forget about the bad reputation China had been built, of course, unwillingly during the first stages of the pandemic, was rather clear in this particular white paper, and strongly reiterated by not only the official trip that Foreign Minister Wang Yi did in Europe, but also from the speeches that Wang Yi and other diplomats had been delivering around Europe, but also around the world, stating that and reiterating that China's priorities for Europe in particular after the pandemic basically are rooted into different lines, into different objectives. First of all, diplomats often reiterate the fact that China is and has become throughout the years the EU's first-rate partner, and that the comprehensive agreement of investment was paramount to be concluded. And if we think back to this particular statement and what happened at the end of December, I think that it is even more striking the emphasis that had been put by Chinese diplomats in this particular sensitive time for China's and the survival of China's international dimension, its role at the global level that was being hindered by all the bad reputation and all the criticism that had been mounting because of the pandemic. The second main topic that has been put forward by Chinese diplomats with regards to Europe noted that the EU and China needed to operate as two complementary forces that could rebalance the international system together after the crisis. Of course, this is another instance of the attempt to further isolate the United States, and consider that at this point we still had to deal with Donald Trump's United States and all the calls for nationalism and isolationism that he has been putting forward in the four years of his presidency. Third, the Chinese diplomats put forward 4 crucial issues that the China-EU partnership should tackle. And according to the main themes that they present, they are basically rooted in cooperation in the health domain, in investments, technology, and green, as well as climate change. And if you think about all these 4 topics that are supposed to be, from at least the Chinese perspective, paramount in the future relations between China and the EU, you will see how the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment in particular, basically cites and tackles all these issues in a way or another. So it doesn't surprise that the CAI was considered as paramount for the future, the short-term future of China-EU relations. Even during the pandemic, I'm thinking after the summer 2020, after the severest phase of the health crisis in Europe had slowly ceased. Well, the deal is, of course, important for a many number of reasons. I invite you to read one of the latest contributions we published from Marco Chirullo, who is responsible for China-EU relations within Digitrade. I think that really gives you an idea of the priorities that move the EU towards the conclusion of this agreement, at least in principle, of course, but also what are the expectations of how this CAI would unfold. Well, the deal is important, but the deal is also important politically, as it shows that the EU's commitment to its own economic sovereignty without constraint from the US is paramount, and it follows the example set by yet another regional agreement with China, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Although the contents of the CAI are way more limited than the ones put forward by the RCEP. And just a brief focus on the RCEP, a very short gloss. This is a trade and investment agreement that several countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australasia have been signing in November within the framework of ASEAN. As China, the EU at this stage has in fact stressed that its priorities for trade and investments in relations with China, which were defined by the March 2019 communication, EU-China Strategic Outlook. I think you all have been reading about that, where China was famously labeled as a strategic competitor. This is something that has been put forward everywhere from journalists to academia since it was basically written in the text. But at the same time, in the same document, you can see that China is also listed as a cooperation partner. This particular outlook thus reflects in an urgent balance, in a sense, an urgent need, to rebalance the relationship with China through engagements, both bilaterally and multilaterally. The CAI, though, undoubtedly is the most ambitious outcome that China has so far agreed to with the third country. And the country has, in a sense, made substantive commitments on the 3 key pillars that were moving the negotiation from the EU side, which were fairly tied to the Union's economic development, economic modernization, and investment and market needs. And these 3 pillars are market access, level playing field, and sustainable development. But I mean, I'm not an economist by training, but when I first saw these pillars being reiterated around different outlets, I was just so puzzled. I said, what does it mean in practice? What is it? Well, I'll try to explain this a little more in depth in practical terms. Well, basically, the CAI puts forward the notion that there will be market access opportunities in crucial sectors for the European Union, such as in the sector of new energy vehicles, cloud services, and of course, health. The CAI will also aims to help level the playing field. And that means that there will be obligations for the behavior of state-owned enterprises and comprehensive transparency rules for subsidies. Within this framework, China will also promote, or at least it has agreed to promote, EU sustainability objectives. The country has in fact agreed to solid provision on sustainable development, such as the implementation of the Paris Agreement, as well as corporate social responsibilities, and we come to the main point, labor issues, including in terms of commitment to implement and ratify the fundamental ILO convention. Before we go further in depth in the labor issues of the agreement, I think it is worth noting that the agreement still needs to be approved by the EU Council and the European Parliament. So the agreement that we have that is an agreement mostly in principle. But as I was mentioning, among all the issues presented in and by the CAI, labor is of course the most debated. In sum, it all boils down to a particular sentence within the text of the agreement, which is make a continued and sustained effort. China has in fact committed to make continued and sustained efforts to pursue the ratification of two fundamental international labor organization norms. First, the Forced Labor Convention, and second, the Abolition of Forced Labor Convention. Yet, what's the point? The point is that even though there is a commitment in writing, there is neither a date or a deadline for the potential ratification of these two conventions anywhere within the document. And that is basically the idea that China has agreed to do something, but there is really little control on what this something and how and when this something will be done. That is the major issue, and that is also a risk for EU institutions themselves, because whether the EU Commission seems to be fairly satisfied with the results of this agreement, the European Parliament has been more and more interested in human rights and labor issues in China in the past few years. So you can see that there is already a disruption in this sense between the two EU institutions. For instance, only last week, former EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker stressed that he had previously failed to reach the same results with the CAI because of the question of whether China, as other countries have proven to be, would be prepared for real to sign the International Labour Organization conventions and bring them to life in a reasonable time. The issue of forced labor, of course, puts the question of the northwestern Chinese region of Xinjiang, which was the main topic of my thesis. And this is basically put at the center of the discussion because Beijing is accused, among others, of having forced hundreds of thousands of ethnic minority people into forced labor, into what are called internment camps. In mid-December, the European Parliament, and you can already see a disruption because in mid-December, the European Parliament had already adopted the urgent resolution for Uyghurs, which includes a clause that bans imports of products suspected of being linked to Uyghur forced labor. Well, a couple of weeks later, the CAI is signed without a strong commitment from China with regards to ILO conventions. So this is the rupture, this is the political ramifications that, in my opinion, are most troublesome for the agreement itself. So basically, as a result, expectations had been for the CAI, if it was to be concluded, to include a greater commitment by Chinese authorities in this sector, in this field. Still, and the message that had been put forward to international observers by this move with these particular attacks and this sentence that had been put forward by the CAI is that, in a sense, at this stage, European values have been pushed aside in favor of a more pragmatic approach. Of course, and as I briefly mentioned before, paraphrasing Sophia Richardson, who is the director of the China program at Human Rights Watch, the European Parliament has become increasingly attentive to issues related to rights in China and could therefore ask for some changes before ratifying the agreement. Other than spurring discussions all around, not only Europe, but all around the world about this particular issue of forced labor and the commitment that China is or isn't willing to put forward and make real in a reasonable time, the CAI has also spurred the foreign policy concerns of major European economies. I would like to briefly go through the main messages that are, in my opinion and the opinion of the expert team with whom I've been working in the past month about this, are bound to shape the China policy of top European economies in 2021. I'm not an expert of all the foreign policies of EU member states, of course. So I will draw extensively from the consideration of these national experts that I've been working with and that we recently gathered in a study on Europe and China and the prospects and constraints for foreign policy in 2021. But I'll start with the star of the CAI, which is of course Germany. Over the last few years, Germany's industry policy had shifted in a sense, especially since the acquisition, the highly publicized, I would add, acquisition of KUKA Robotics by China's Midea in 2016, towards a more cautious approach vis-a-vis China. Of course, this change of attitude is not always very clear, and I think that it is well exemplified in the relatively hasty push that Germany had done to conclude the comprehensive agreement on investment with China in late December, right before the end of the German rotating presidency of the Council of the EU. Still, German politics has also shifted towards a harder stance on China, and the expectations of experts is for the successor of Angela Merkel will take up a different line on relations with Beijing. However, the point is that after the CAI within Europe, there is little consensus with regards to the best approach to take to really engage with China. And at the same time, the usual Franco-German cooperation framework might really not be enough. And so Germany will have also to look at how to entail a new EU consensus towards a China policy in the EU if the country wants to stick with the general idea that has been moving its foreign policy, but also France's foreign policy with regards to China, which is that the best approach is multilateral and within EU institutions. France is currently facing, like I think many of European countries, an overall negative public opinion of China. It is true for Italy as well. But over the past year or so, the country's approach to China has also been shifting away from nationally low profile towards more firmness. Until now, of course, this had not always been translated into real policy actions, but the narrative has become more assertive. Of course, President Macron is well known for his ambivalent stance vis-a-vis China. At least, but at the same time, experts of France's foreign policy think and consider 2021 and the aftermath of the CAI to be a critical juncture that is likely to change the present context with more firmness, both in rhetoric, but also in action. However, of course, China's cooperation will continue to be sought by France on common issues, especially those issues that are of the most importance for France. More specifically, China's support will be needed in order to effectively respond to a broad change of key global issues. For instance, the Paris Agreement on climate change, but also preservation of biodiversity and WTO reform. And you would say, and you would be fairly right, to comment to these topics, to these priorities, that these are all the same issues that the EU and some European member states have always put forward in their relation with China, in their putting forward some sort of cooperation, in showing that this cooperation is actually broadening, because in some and at the basis, all these issues find the overall agreement between the two parties. I think that one of the most interesting prospects for European member states and their approach to China comes from Spain. China has been in the periphery of Spanish foreign policy, and the position that Spain has had toward China has been overall more reactive than a proactive policy. Spain has to progressively learn how to approach the PRC, because the PRC has been broadening its presence and interest in those areas that were traditionally vital for Spain, which are Europe, of course, the Mediterranean, but also Latin America. There are several structural issues that actually hinder Spain's foreign policy and the country's approach toward China. But I think that the major one, and I think it's something that has been studied and put forward quite a lot in the past few months, is the fact that Spain at this stage has lost a lot of weight within the EU. And the reduction of weight and importance had been clearly seen during the negotiation for the CAI, this last round of negotiation for the CAI, where Spain, together with other countries such as Italy and Poland, have been criticizing the German presidency of the EU Council for ignoring calls for more precaution and for risks of alienating incoming US President Joe Biden. Jake Sullivan, who is Joe Biden's national security advisor, has been very vocal to counter and to really go against the CAI, even before Joe Biden had been sworn in as US president. Well, last but not least, Italy, the country I come from, and the country that, in my opinion, has had the most confused foreign policy toward China within the European Union. Italy and China relations have experienced significant shifts since the beginning of President Xi Jinping's first mandate, partly because of very different views of governing coalitions over those years, and we had a few, and a widespread, outdated perception of the need to adapt bilaterally to the so-called China's rise. Luckily, and we're in 2021, and I think that that is something that we should all agree on, is that China has already risen. There is no China's rise anymore. We need to really move forward that notion. But those swings in the Italian approach towards China have resulted in a very confused perception of Italy's China policy, both from the part of China itself and European partners. The COVID-19 pandemic brought an unexpected twist to Italy-China relations in direction that have further added to the confusion that had prevailed earlier. And as the first wave of the pandemic gradually abated in Italy in December of 2020, China's soft power, public diplomatic tools that proved not to be the great asset that at the beginning of the spring had been presented. I mean, they were presented as the assets that would actually ensure Italy's swift resolution of the pandemic, of the health crisis. Well, this quite awareness generated another level of awareness toward China, because China's business objectives and wider political goals to increase its presence in Europe were actually heightened and highlighted. I'd like to point to the fact that there have been several surveys conducted with the Italian expert community, the Italian population throughout 2020. I think that one of the first was the one conducted by the International Affairs Institute in Rome with, I think, University of Pisa, which I think they're nice reading, and I think that they're quite interesting data in there. So if you're interested to see how public perception has been emerging in Italy, especially at the most critical juncture, I would urge you to really do have a look. From our part, from ISPI, we actually use some traditional surveys that we do. We conduct end of the year annual expert surveys to investigate changes in the way international politics is perceived nationwide among the expert community, which have offered some empirical data to us through discussions about Italy-China relations in 2021. We actually conducted that time series starting from 2015 to 2020, with December 2020, which was the last data, of course, available. And we looked at the longitudinal development of perceptions since 2015. I think that the most interesting part to look at, and there are again some figures that we built that if you're interested you can have a look at, is that these surveys show something that has been quite, I think, underestimated in general in Italy, and that the Italian expert community's awareness of China's role in the world has not been acquired only as a result of major political events or major crises like the well-known Memorandum of Understanding or the pandemic, as many have been claiming, but have resulted from an extensive process of discovery and realization. The problem with Italy's foreign policy, Italy's China policy, if we want to call it that, is that it somehow lacks a long-term strategy and really is rooted into short-termism. I think that at this point, at this stage, after this major crisis that has affected us all, Italy is in the position to really develop a long-term strategy and possibly seek the support of other Mediterranean countries. The problem, of course, with Italy boils down to what our new government will prioritize and whether there will be some space to devise something long-lasting that short-term policies towards the country. I do know that in this presentation I've put a lot of stuff to discuss on. Again, thank you all for being here this morning, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Of course, I leave back the floor to Alice as well, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giulia. Your presentation has been really insightful. You gave us a lot of inputs about to think on, and I'm sure that we will have a very lively conversation engagement here. And so I want to remind the audience that if you want, you can ask directly the question to Julia, write them in the chat. But please always write me through my private chat if you want to ask the question directly or if you want me to read it, and specify also the questions so that we can move on also faster a bit. And while you know think about and phrase your question, I have a lot to ask to Julia, but I will start with just one or two. I will try to stay brief. And one is for the first part of your presentation, the second for the other. So the first one is about, you said that the the behavior or the interest that China was having in the EU was came from also the influence of the Trump administration. So it was also to try to engage with the EU in order also to try to limit the power of the US. Do you think that with the Biden administration is coming up right now, this behavior of China will change maybe the approach, not the the interest that China has towards you, but maybe the approach?
Would you like perhaps to just give me a couple of questions so that I can?
Yeah, sure. And the second question that I have for you is actually also really connected to the one that our president, Patrizia Kogo, wanted to ask you. So I will read the two together because you're very close. And so Patrizia was telling us that, first of all, she thanks you so much for the presentation because this was wonderful. And that in the recent interview with Fides Nagorta, a Spanish diplomat that European Guanxi has published last Monday, we were commenting precisely on the topic of the CAA and the labor rights. And in the agreement was reached in December 2020, and China consented to make continued and sustained effort to ratify the International Labour Organization, the ILO, fundamental conventions of forced labor. And he said that in this way, we can possibly attain progress, but he also highlighted that we as Europeans have to be aware of the limits of the influence that we can bring about with an investment agreement in order to achieve structural changes in the Chinese system. So at the end of the day, what we are asking China is to do something that goes to the root of the Chinese political system. So, and even though the EU will never give up on defending the human rights abroad, and it is one of our, fundamental values, do you think it is realistic to hope to have China to ratify these treaties? I mean, the question that I had was, do you think that the CAA can come in the end as a result of like what also happened with the WTO in 2001? We, tried to let China enter WTO, hoping for a sort of democratization of China, and then we are experiencing what we do today. And so maybe also with the CAA, we might have the same results or no. So these are the two questions, and I will collect all the others.
Thank you very much for both the questions. Very interesting. Well, with regards to Biden and China's changing of the approach or the means through which these approaches, the tools that China employs to put forward these its aims towards Europe, well, with Biden, the short answer is no. I think that I don't think that the competition between China and the US is going to cease with Biden, and I don't even think, and Biden has been very transparent at this point about his China policy. It's still going to be assertive. The main difference will be that he will seek more multilateralism. So at the very least, we're going to see even more competition towards Europe with Biden and China. But also, I think that the United States has made very clear that their priority is not Europe, but it's the Indo-Pacific region. So the main competition with China, I think, is going to be there. And there we will have to see and look what things unfold. And I think that this is also because, not only because the Indo-Pacific region is, of course, one of the most strategic regions in the world for international trade, but the RCEP, in my opinion, and with the US, its traditional partners, Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and New Zealand as well, being part of our RCEP, and China, in a sense, widening its network in that particular region, that is where the worries of the Biden's administration lay. So no, I think that we'll see maybe less wolf warrior diplomacy, less, I hope, no random tweets from the US president toward China, no even racist remarks from the US president toward China, because there's been quite plenty uncalled for racist remarks from Trump towards China, with the China virus, the awful, all that awful rhetoric that really had no place. But yes, I think that the competition will be posed in a different manner. Europe will be into that competition, but the real competition will be in the Indo-Pacific. Passing on to the second question, I'm a bit of a skeptic with regards to the comprehensive agreement on investment. I don't think we're going to see major advancement in the ratification of the ILO conventions. That is why I'm particularly worried about the fact that there is no deadline, and as well as there is no fixed date set within the agreement, maybe even a 5-year commitment period before signing the ILO convention. There is nothing of the sort. And I think that there is nothing of the sort because negotiation couldn't include them. The EU negotiators probably didn't manage to really get China to agree to a set date to really set the date for the ratification. And I think that is also being clear by Juncker's remarks, because it's not like this issue hadn't been at the core of European negotiations in the past, so they were fully aware of this. And just briefly, because I think we have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to add that I've also been very skeptic about the notion of a democratization of China. And I don't think that the country is possibly ready to go in that direction. I'm not even sure that is the best option for the country as it is today, as it is structured. Of course, we as European, of course, that's not to say that that is not going to happen, or that some the democratic values, the democratic liberties could not be embedded within the system. But I think that we have to rethink, and I think that actually policymakers are fairly aware of that at this stage, that there could be another way, another process that China could take to really embed some democratic values without committing to the full process of democratization. And I close there.
Thank you, Giulia. Next question is from Boris, and we wanted to ask you if you could please explain the 5G technology development between China and Europe. Do you think that cultural relativism and the diplomacy with the USA are the main barrier for China-EU diplomacy? Why or why not? And so actually the 5G technology development between China and Europe, I think, is the core of the question.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this question. I just it's one, I think it's the topic, after the CAI, it's the topic, not only 5G technology, but in general, the Chinese offensive with regards to technologies, and how is Europe handling this offensive. I mean, just to be fairly blunt, I would say that Europe continues, and the EU in particular, continues to really adopt a reaction approach and not a very proactive approach towards Chinese offensive. There have been a lot of tools that the EU has been implementing in in the past year, and really to really tackle the offensive in a domain that at base has still a lot of questions for everybody else in the world. And China is the first country that is still understanding how these technological issues will unfold, and especially will go in depth into the political realm. I'm going to mention just a couple, for instance, and I think that the most interesting part is the fact that the EU is devoting quite a lot of effort to really understand how a data right framework could be implemented, especially with regards to the entering of major Chinese platforms within the European market. I'm thinking about TikTok, for instance, that we've been talking a lot, and a lot of stuff have been going on around the world, in India and the United States, but still TikTok is a reality that involves also Europe, and towards which the EU has been working quite extensively to really understand what data rights are, how can they be, whether they are human rights, and how the EU should protect and ensure that data rights are actually protected, even when third parties are inserted in the conversation, have a say in them. There are a lot of different frameworks with regards also to cybersecurity, for instance. The EU has called for sanctions against cyber attacks from China. It was the first time during the pandemic because of these of the fact that China was recognized to have conducted cyber attacks against some institutions and businesses within the European Union during the acute phase of the pandemic. If you're interested in really going in depth and see everything that the EU has done and how, with regards to technology, and especially how these actions are actually a reaction to some things that the China offensive has brought forward, I will include a link in the chat of a small, focus subject grounder that we just published that specifically looks at that, because there is quite a number of initiatives, and you can see that not only is the EU looking for a reaction to this offensive, but it is also actually promoting quite a variety. In a sense, it's trying different pathways to really tackle this notion.
Thank you so much, Giulia. And next question is from Ilaria Tassari, which is also our Vice President. So I will let her ask directly.
Thank you, Alessia. Thank you, Giulia, for this fantastic presentation. It is indeed a very wide topic, so it's full of themes, and I understand we only have an hour today, but it's been fantastic. I'm really interested in this topic. So I think I agree with you that the issue at stake, or at least the focus that has also been like under the spotlight, let's say, is labor issues that have been under the spotlight in the last few years. And these see AI as being fundamental, crucial to understand also what is the reaction, or at least this little shift towards economic interests other than values. So I totally agree. My question regards more basically the predominance of France and Germany, and also the conclusion of this agreement despite the resolution on the Uyghurs and so forth labor. I would like to ask you if you think that apart from the disruption at the political level, at the institutional level, that has been, of course, an alarming or worrying for many observers, if there may be an inherent, more serious problem in terms of competences of the European Parliament the power of the single member states like Germany and France, if you also identify that there is a worrying trend that can also have a follow-up in the aftermath of the CAI, or if it is more to be considered a single event, let's say a single fact, and that we should expect more assertiveness on human rights and in particular forced labor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilaria, for your question. Well, I'm not an expert on European institutions, of course. I trained as a China expert, but I would say this. I think that of course, there is this disruption within the EU institutions, because the resolution that I mentioned with the Uyghurs and the EU Parliament, it's just the last thing, the last policy implemented, the last action from the EU Parliament, and I think it goes back quite a few years. I'm thinking of the Sakharov Prize, Sri Lamtoti, which is a Uyghur activist who is currently in jail, has been for quite some time, as a starter, for instance. So I think that is, in a sense, competition between the parliament that actually puts the EU values at the core and the commission that at this stage has been prioritizing economic interest and the economic revival of the EU economy, of course, after the pandemic, is going to be a trend, at least with regards to China, at least for the first half of 2021. I think that the question that one should, or at least what the issue that we will have to monitor quite closely, are actually far away from Europe, and they are the moments of and the instances of political contestation that have been going on in China, how they unfold, and at the same time, how the EU decides to react, looking at discrepancies from what the EU Parliament aims to do, strives to do, the line that the European Parliament presents, as well as what the Commission actually does and where the Commission actually goes. I'm thinking, for instance, of the Taiwan issue, above all, which is the big red line for 2021. There was this wonderful survey that the Mercator Institute in Berlin did at the beginning of 2021 with a lot of Asian and China experts that really singled Taiwan out as the issue. I think that, as well as Hong Kong and partly Xinjiang, because unfortunately Xinjiang is always a bit put on the sidelines of the general conversation internationally, will be the real issues to look at, especially with regards to these disruption between EU institution and European approach.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia. Here we have a lot of questions, but unfortunately our time is quite, we're out of time a little. So if you're available, some of them, the interested people who wanted to ask them, you can write to Giulia, she's available. And
yeah,
she
sure.
can send some answers or also some good insights to look at. And so we will go with only the last question, like the first of the last that I was receiving, and so we can close our incredible meeting of today. So the question comes from Mateus Bilar, and he's actually from Tianjin, so also we are also followed internationally, and he wanted to ask you, do you see China's efforts in Europe as a dual wedge, an attempt towards a united, coherent EU policy towards China, and an attempt towards a transatlantic effort, which could significantly undermine China's efforts, both globally and regionally, as major European states, including the UK, have become more hawkish and begun to tilt towards the Indo-Pacific region, concerned about China's growing influence?
Alessia, I need to ask, can you maybe summarize a bit, because I've had some interference when you were
Yeah,
reading the
sorry.
question.
Yeah,
No,
sure.
sorry.
But I think that Mateus wanted to ask you if China's efforts in Europe are an attempt to like disperse the EU policy towards China, or just towards the transatlantic effort. So I think he wanted to ask you if that the
Yeah.
approach that China was trying to reach in Europe was more for, trying to diverge the EU policy by Europe, or Europe and US.
Well, that's a great question. I think that, in a sense, whether there is a prioritization of one aspect or the other, only at John and Hai, they know that for sure. I think that the aim is dual, but in a sense, especially at the end of 2020 and more than at the end in the last half of 2020, the major aim had been really to counterbalance transatlantic relations, because there was a chance there. Trump was still the president, there was a giant crisis going on, the United States did not step up during the crisis, as it was basically the traditional approach of the US during major global crisis. And so I think that that was the major aspect that was prioritized by China at the end of 2020. But we will see in 2021 whether there will be still a prioritization of this particular aim, or whether there will be other aims coming up afterwards.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to close our incredible meeting now, but I wanted to thank you so much again for your incredible insights, also for all the inputs that you gave us. And I wanted to remember all the audience not to rush out, because now you will receive a poll now here on Zoom, on which you can answer. And as I told you at the beginning, we will also share the answers, the results of the poll in our private groups, also on LinkedIn. So just wait for a few seconds. And thank you so much again.